Welcome to Sacred Caregiving. My name is Barbara, and today I'd like to talk about what led me to create this community for non medical caregivers. In 2008, I had the first of many major paradigm shifts in my life. I was working full time as an English teacher at a Corton Community High School, and in February I got laid off. At the end of February, beginning of March, we found out that my mom had stage 2 breast cancer. And typical mom, she had been a nurse for over 40 years. She said to the surgeon, when the surgeon went over her options of mastectomy versus lumpectomy, she was just like, take it off. She's like, I'm 63 years old. I don't need it anymore. Just take it off. She was also very spiritual and very religious within her practice of being an Episcopalian. She baptized me in the Episcopal Church when I was a baby. She raised me in the Episcopal Church. There were times that, yes, she was a high holy day Episcopalian, but it was still a value that she held, that I still hold. And she told the surgeon, she's like, I want this done after Easter Sunday. She said, I want to visit this in the light of the resurrection, not in the darkness of Lent. And the surgeon was like, kind of looked at her a little surprised, and then was just like, yeah, that's fine. She's like, I'm going out of town for spring break anyway. She's like, I'll be back like end of April and we can do that. So, the day after my dad had his birthday, my dad's birthday is the 24th of April, 25th of April, my mom went in for her mastectomy. Now, just to clarify, my mom and dad by this time had been divorced. My dad remarried to a wonderful woman. They were still involved in my life to the extent that I let them, and while all of this was happening, my uncle, my mom's brother, and his wife had a paradigm shift in their own life and ended up having to sell their house and relocate. They decided to relocate down to Santa Rosa so that they could be closer to my mom. Because at the time we lived in San Rafael, California. So it was about hour and a half, depending upon traffic, away from us. So, and they were in the position at the time that they were also seeking employment. So they were able to actually be there for me and my mom during that period. And I realized after I became a personal care aide in Oklahoma that not everyone has that family support that they can rely on. And this started out in 2008 with my mom, and we started recording all of me being English teacher and majoring in creative writing. I started like a list of like all of the tips and tricks that we learned going through this, which is part of what this community is about, is, sharing with you tips and tricks and things that I learned along the way on how to do things that will hopefully make your caregiving journey a little bit easier. So, 2008, my mom had her right breast mastectomy, and I suddenly found myself going from creating lesson plans and grading papers and giving instruction in front of the class and interacting with students to now I was pretty much isolated in our condominium with my mom, doing dressing changes, emptying her Jackson Pratt drinks, helping her with the shower, helping her get dressed. All of these things that, like, she was the nurse. She was the one who had been doing all of these things all of these years and was familiar with some of it. She was, not as familiar with, like, how to empty a Jackson Pratt drain because that was something that she never experienced in her nursing career. So there was that aspect of it. There were, even a nurse after 40 plus years still had things that she was learning along the way. And being 63 years old, she wasn't, eligible for retirement. So after she had her mastectomy, she went back to work. And I was looking for a job again. So, fast forward to 2011. We found out that her breast cancer had returned, that it was now stage 4, that it had metastasized to her bones, and that she had gone from hormone receptor positive to triple negative breast cancer. She had been on hormone blockers since her mastectomy in 2008. So she had been on hormone blockers for 3 years. The biology of her cancer changed. And, back in 2011, there were not the options that we have now for triple negative breast cancer, for even the treatment of breast cancer. There was a limited number of options for her, especially given that now the biology had flipped from hormone receptor positive, which meant that they could put her on hormone blockers, they could do like the preventative chemo, all of the things that she did in 2008 to try to keep this from coming back. The oncologist told us, she's like, if you make it 5 years, then she said, we consider you cancer free and basically in remission. We got 3 years before the cancer came back. And 2011, my mom, again, being the ever practical one, was like, okay, we have, by that point she was still ambulatory, meaning she could still get around under her own steam, so to speak. The bone mets caused her to have pain, probably more pain than she let on. But she was just like, we have non-refundable tickets to Scotland in April of 2012. She's like, figure out how to get us there. And we did. We came up with a plan. And even though we were on vacation, it was for my 40th birthday, all of the things and she was still, like I said, still under her own steam. It did not stop my caregiving. It didn't put my caregiving on hold just because we were on a trip. Just because this was, like, what we came to realize was that her final international trip. that it was, a trip we had been talking about doing and were really excited about when we found out about it in September 2011. All of these things that came into play. I still did not stop being a caregiver. I still had to make sure that my mom got on and off the bus safely. I had to make sure that they had stowed her walker in the undercarriage of the bus so that we could get it out. I had to make sure, that we had all of the luggage with us. When we were going through the TSA screening, I was the one who had to, keep track of all of the carry-ons, keep track of where she was, because they being, she got a wheelchair assist. Well, we were at the airports, so she got a wheelchair assist. And then she had her wheeled walker and her cane. But I was still the one that was having to make sure all of these things, set timers for the medication schedule to make sure that, she stayed on track with her pain meds, because we were on a bus 8-9 hours a day. We were on and off the bus. Typical bus tour, you'd stop at a certain location, you'd get off, you'd roam around for anywhere from 45 minutes, hour and a half, back on the bus. So it was trying to make sure that, we allowed plenty of time to do what it was that we were doing on the tour. Allow plenty of time for us to get back on the bus. All of these things we had to make sure of. And, as you'll find out later, not all hotels in foreign countries are ADA compliant. So there was no ADA handicapped accessible room for Mom. It was still we were lucky that at least one of the hotels that we were staying at had an elevator. It was an old rickety elevator that was probably built in the 1920s. But it was still an elevator to where she could, get on the elevator with her walker, and I'd haul the suitcases up the stairs to our room. Or in, I think, one case, they actually put our suitcases in with Mom. Mom sat down on her walker, and then I ran up the stairs. And then it was once we were in the room figuring out, okay, this is how you're going to have to maneuver with your walker to get into the bathroom. A lot of the places only had a bathtub, or fortunately, some of them would have the bathtub with the shower spray. And I'd be okay, and I'd figure out while it was dry, while we hadn't done any showering or bathing or anything yet, I would go in there and I would figure out how she could potentially get into and out of the bathtub. And she would sit on her walker in the doorway of the bathroom, because a lot of times the bathrooms weren't big enough to have her walker in. So and she had one of those wheeled walkers with a seat, so she'd sit down on the seat of the walker and she'd watch me do the dry run through, and she'd be she'd approach it from her nursing standpoint, from her home care standpoint, and also from the standpoint of the patient. And together we'd figure out, okay, this bathtub is too deep for you to be able to get into and out of, so that ain't gonna work. We'd have to figure out, could she potentially sit on the edge of the bathtub and, like shower spray herself and then soap up. In a couple of cases, there were showers, so she was able to stand up in the shower and bathe herself. You know, in some cases, yeah, we'd fill up the tub. I'd give her, you know, a washcloth that was soaked up, and she'd like sit on the toilet and do a sponge bath because the tub was too deep, or you know, she couldn't get into and out of the tub, or it was, you know, she was too tired to do much of anything else. So we have to figure those things out ahead of time. So even though we were on vacation, I was still the caregiver. As things progressed, in 2014, her her, you know, stage 4 cancer had metastasized to the point that she needed to have that her options were pretty much over. Actually, no, wait a minute. Sorry. 2013. You know, her metastasis was getting worse, but we decided at that point, you know, okay, she's had her wheeled walker. She was getting to the point that she needed a wheelchair. So we got her a wheelchair rental from the DME, from the Durable Medical Equipment Company. And I clearly remember pushing her up one of the San Francisco hills, a half a block, in the wheelchair, with her bag of portable oxygen, because back then they didn't have the portable oxygen concentrators and all of the things that they had now. They had like little, like, basically oxygen tanks that were about like this size, would last about an hour. And the place where we were going, we knew that we were going to be there more than an hour, because we were going for our annual St. Patrick's Day celebration. Because Mom knew, even though I was still kind of in denial at this point, that was going to be it. You know, that was going to be probably her last one. So we went, and then shortly thereafter, like, we went to St. Patrick's Day. We went to a concert for our favorite band, Brother, in Petaluma. You know, again, on oxygen, on the wheelchair, and I was having to coordinate all of this. You know, I'm having to coordinate, like, putting the oxygen tank in the big oxygen tank in the car, because my mom didn't want to use the little portable oxygen tanks going to and from. She wanted to be able to save that and have like the big oxygen tank in the car. So it was, picture this, little 89 Honda Civic. Actually, no, that was 2002 Honda Civic. But anyway, 2002 Honda Civic. So not a big car. We're talking the big oxygen tanks that are probably about 5 foot tall in the back of the car. The oxygen tubing and mask coming, the oxygen tubing and nasal cannula coming over the seat to the passenger front seat, and getting my mom in there, and then getting the wheelchair on the other side on the driver's side of the car, and putting the footrest on the seat itself, on the back seat itself. Now you might be asking, why didn't we put it in the trunk? It would not fit in the trunk. We tried. But the space on the Honda, the space between like where the back end of the car was and how they cut the space for the trunk itself um was too shallow, so you couldn't get it in there. So even though we would go and do all of these fun things, we still had to have these things in the back of our minds. When we went to Christmas services, then our minister had been through this with his late wife who had died from cancer. So he was like, I know you guys like to go to the midnight mass, but why don't you consider going to the daytime service on Christmas Day? He's like, it's not as crowded. He's like, you can go, you can, park the wheelchair, all of the things. So those were the things that we now had to take into consideration. By late November 2000, late October 2014, or 2013 rather. Late November 2013, my mom decided to go on hospice. She was not the typical hospice patient, as she, said to me. She's like, I'm not imminently terminal, which means she wasn't going to die tomorrow. But she said, I'm using it as palliative care because there is nothing more that the medical team can offer me other than just to make me comfortable. And I was like, okay. Now she's telling me this driving home because by that point, like, she was like, she wasn't on hospice yet. She was still getting around fairly well. She was still relatively independent. I took a part-time job about 2 hours away teaching English. I had only been teaching there about 6 weeks when Mom called because she had an appointment with her oncologist that day, and I couldn't get away to go to the oncology appointment with her. And I called her, as I usually do, to tell her I was heading home. And I was just kind of like, so what did the oncologist say? And she was like, well, I'd rather tell you about it when you get home. Well, to me, that's an immediate red flag, because the last time she pulled that was to tell me that my great aunt had died. My great aunt Flo, who I was close to. And she was like, she's like, I'd rather tell you when you get home. I was just like, no, tell me now. She was like, okay, but she's like, you have to pull over the car. And I'm getting emotional even thinking about this, but I want to be real with you guys. I just don't want it to seem like, everything was happy-go-lucky, everything was fine. I want to be real with you. So you may see me cry, and that's okay. But she told me, over the phone, I decided to go to hospice. I'm not imminently terminal, but the medical facility does not offer palliative care. So she's like, she's like, there's basically nothing more that they can do. And of course, like, I get off the phone with her and I'm sobbing in my car at a rest stop. You remember those? And I was just like, okay, I've got to pull it together to drive home. I called our friend who's a medical intuitive, who I had done work with in the past for previous injuries and previous spiritual and emotional crises. Pretty sure this qualified as a spiritual and emotional crisis. I called her. I said, I'm driving home. I said, I'm trying to keep it together. I said, could you just basically hold sacred space for me until I get home, and we'll set up an appointment to talk about this and, do work on this. And, she did. She held sacred space for me. And for those of you who are, Christian faith-based or, religion-based, basically within that context, she prayed for me. Within the metaphysical empath world, she basically put her shield around me so that I could be calm enough to drive home. So, pulled in the driveway, pulled in the carport, went in, and Mom and I just sobbed for a while because she knew that she had known since the diagnosis of the stage 4 cancer that this would eventually be the result. And she knew as a nurse. But it's a whole lot different when you're actually confronted with it actually hits you in the face. And, God loved the school that I was working for because they said, we will give you an unpaid leave until after Christmas and then let us know before the new year what you want to do. And, even the union was like, that's unheard of for a school to do that, especially with a teacher that's still in their probationary period to do that. But they did that because other women in the school had cancer in some way touch their lives. So they were like, let's do this for Barbara. Let's support her in this way. Let's see. So, Mom got on hospice. Turned out that one of the hospice volunteers actually went to our church. And she, suggested to us, she was like, well, have you thought about having student nurses come in? So we had student nurses come in. The hospice workers were coming in. Remember back when I said that one of my first jobs in home care was doing the patient schedules? Yeah. Now I was doing that for Mom and coordinating the student nurses and when they were coming in. When the home care nurses when the hospice nurses were coming in, when the hospice, aides were coming in, when the hospice chaplain was coming in, when her friends wanted to come visit, whether or not her friends were going to just be there to visit or whether they were going to actually help. And I remember at one point we had to put a post on social media and say, we know that you love Laura. We know that you love Barbara. However, please coordinate with Barbara when you're going to come visit and whether or not you're just coming to visit or whether you want to help. And if you're there to help, what you are comfortable doing. Like I said, by this time, both my aunt and uncle had jobs. They both told their employer, look, we need this 1 day a week off. We need Tuesdays off because we're helping our niece to care for his sister. And they agreed, so once a week on a Tuesday, they'd come down, they'd gather up all of the laundry, they'd bring a meal for us. My Auntie Lon would stay with my mom while my uncle Fritz and I went out and did the grocery shopping or ran whatever errands needed to be run. We do all of that on that day. And then, once the errands and everything were done, they'd go back to their house. My Aunt Lon would throw all of the laundry into her, full-size washer and dryer, because we only had a mini stackable washer and dryer, not even full-size, just one of those little ones that you find in basically a condo, because that's what we were living in. And so I now had this help. But even with the help, it still wasn't to the point that I could go off and teach, which was our initial hope, was that, these people would be able to fill in, everything would be okay, and, by the time we got to, the stage of her really needing to be, full 24/7 caregiving, that, by that time the school year would be over and I could just go. Didn't work out that way. She had a gradual decline, as we had anticipated. And I found myself, like I said, suddenly I was the one cleaning her up at 3:00 in the morning because the suppository that the nurse had put on at noon had suddenly decided to work 13 hours later. 12, 13, 14, 15, whatever hours later. So I'm sitting, I'm standing over the bed with the basin and with 2 basins with soapy water and rinse water and washing her off and rinsing her off and changing all of the bed linens again, changing her out of her soiled. It was okay, mom soiled herself. Now what do we do? Is it just on the pads or is it on the sheets too? If it was just on the pads, fine, great, terrific. We could just take the pads out, throw them away, put new pads on, wash her off, take the wet pads out, throw them away, put dry pads underneath her, get her in a clean night clothes, and be done with it. So all of this was going on. And at the time, the law was such that a family member could not get paid to take care of another family giver. That law, fortunately, has since changed. But at the time, we were down to surviving on her income, on her retirement, because by now she had retired from nursing. Well, she retired from active home care nursing. She was still instructing right up almost until her death. She kept her nursing license because that was so much a part of her identity. And she really debated with herself and with me, like, when it was time to renew her license. And by then she was like bedbound and on hospice, and she still struggled with the idea of like letting her nursing license go. But she finally did because she realized financially it didn't make sense for her to keep her license, and that was one more thing I was going to have to deal with when she passed away, was notifying the nursing board. As she deteriorated to the point that she was bedbound and was not able to get up and clean herself and toilet herself and all of that stuff, then my responsibility became, not only cleaning her up, but also like emptying her Foley catheter bag and, like I said, coordinating her schedules, cooking all of the meals, cleaning the house, doing all of these things. And when we hired the student nurses, my mom was like, well, why don't you just do a list? She's like, do a list of like everything that you do on like a daily, weekly basis. That thing was about 2.5 pages long by the time I got done with it. Like 2.5 pages, single spaced, okay? And I said, like, when we interviewed the nursing students, I said, here's the list. I said, highlight the things that you are comfortable with and put your name at the top of it. I said, that way I will know, like, oh, I can leave the dishes for this student nurse to do. This student nurse is okay doing dishes. This student nurse is okay emptying Foley bag. This student nurse is, like, okay with, helping the aides to give her a bath. Because when we started out on hospice, she had one aide come in, a couple of times a week to bathe her. This was a woman who was used to daily bathing. And, the student nurses, a lot of them had their CNAs already. They had their certified nursing assistant, so they could come in and act as an aide as well. So there were things that they were comfortable with that I knew that I could leave those things for them to do. So, and I realized as we were going along, like at one point, even though my mom was on hospice, she still had the durable power of attorney for health care for her best friend that she had known since she was 9 years old. And at one point, my mom was telling her friend's visitor, one of the people that the family's housekeeper had gone to visit my mom's friend when she was in the hospital, and she said somebody came in with like a piece of paper, slammed it down on the table, and told them that my mom's friend was being discharged. I said, gee, they didn't notify me, and I have the durable power of attorney for health care. I heard my mom give the hospital crap. And, this was at the time when she was on hospice, but she was still ambulatory. And that was when I had this flash, and I said, Mom, I'm like, Mom, what is this QIO process that you're talking about? And she explained it to me, and I said, you have a lot of knowledge that, like, I'm not aware of as your caregiver and as your durable power of attorney for healthcare. I said, let's start going through some of this stuff. So that's how this community sort of started, was my mom and I brainstorming all of these things that she knew about as a nurse, the things that I had, that, I picked up taking care of her. After she passed in 2014, in 2016, I moved back. I sold the house in California and moved to Oklahoma. got a job in 2017 as, and well, let me back up a little bit. In 2016, shortly after I moved back here, then my dad's brother got diagnosed with cancer. And so I now found myself like volunteering to chauffeur he and his wife and my grandma to the doctor's appointments. I can very clearly remember sitting in, you know, the exam room with the oncologist, and it was me and my uncle and my uncle's wife and my grandma. And by this time, my grandma was 91 years old. She was still ambulatory. She was still getting around and stuff. She didn't hear all that great, but, you know, she still got around pretty good. She got around like our small town pretty good. If there was a doctor's appointment that she had somewhere other than like our small town, then if she had to go to like the city just over the border, then over the border into Arkansas, let's be clear. Over the border into Arkansas, then I drive her. You know, all of these things. And I eventually interviewed for, I had been looking for jobs all this time. I had gotten like my preliminary Oklahoma credential. But again, small town. One elementary school, one middle school, one high school. That was it. This was before even the 7th and 8th grade center existed. So couldn't really find a job teaching anywhere in the vicinity of my small towns, even the neighboring towns and whatnot. Got a job, like, I was just like literally like scrolling for any jobs at that point. Looked for home care jobs, figuring, maybe I'd get a job in the home care office, doing what I did before. They had an advertisement for a personal care aide. Started reading the job description. I was like, holy crap, that was everything that I used to do for mom. Okay, yeah, I can do this. So I started as a professional personal care aide, working through a home care agency. And then I learned more tips and tricks going along caring for these people. And one of the people that I was caring for, she was also a writer. And, she would say, oh, you should put this in your book. You should put this in your book. You should, yeah, that's a good idea to put in your book. So she was a great resource. Then later on, about 2019, I believe 2019, 2020, it became that my grandmother was slowly deteriorating. She was no longer able to drive herself places. She was getting a little more confused. Things like that. My dad's sister and brother-in-law had uprooted their lives and moved to Oklahoma to help take care of grandma, but also help take care of my uncle's widow. Just to basically help look after the family. And they agreed, and they uprooted their lives and moved to Oklahoma. While they're dealing with all of that stuff, my other uncle, my dad's brother-in-law, my dad's brother passed 2017. He asked, he and his wife and my grandma took a trip out to California for like a big Burgess family reunion because they wanted to see everybody. And at the time, like, my uncle made the request of his sister and brother-in-law, when I pass, will you help take care of the family? And they instantly agreed. Uprooted their lives, like I said, after my Uncle Bill died, and moved back here to Oklahoma. And we had, but as Grandma was slowly declining, my aunt needed more help with her. So she asked me, would I help look after Grandma? Well, as Grandma needed more care, I was like, this is crazy, you paying me out of your pocket when I do this professionally. You can go through this program and go through this case manager who I work closely with, who was the case manager for one of my other clients. And I said, go through the program, meet with the clinical manager the case manager, and go from there. So I became personal carried to my original client and Grandma. And then after a while, I had to drop my other client because Grandma's schedule was getting more and more, was constantly changing. Because my dad's brother-in-law, my aunt's husband, his cancer had come back. About the time that, my mom had finished up with her first round of chemotherapy in 2008, then we discovered that my dad's brother-in-law had gotten male breast cancer. And we discovered that my cousin's oldest son, I call him my nephew, Little Will, had leukemia. So, by the time I moved back here in 2016, Little Will had passed. I realized that Grandma was getting older. I had come back for her 90th birthday and basically went back home, sold my condo, and bought a house back here. To be closer to Grandma, to watch the kids grow up, because I realized that, in all of Little Will's life, I had only basically met him once. That was it. His dad would send me pictures and stuff. We'd help the family out when they had doctor's appointments, when he was undergoing his chemo at the Children's Hospital in Tulsa and Oklahoma City. We helped them out with, food cards and whatnot. So, 2000, so fast forward to like 2019, I believe, 2020, somewhere around there, because it was like, and I'm now taking care of Grandma and my other client. I eventually had to drop my other client because, like I said, my aunt's husband, my Uncle Larry, had his male breast cancer had returned. And as my Auntie Deb said, it was like playing whack-a-mole. So he had all kinds of doctor's appointments and whatnot that my Auntie Deb had to take him to. So I dropped my other client. I just saw Grandma so that I could be available to, change my schedule as needed. My aunt got a job working on Saturdays, so eventually I was working 6 days a week. And then I got COVID. I got COVID in 2020. Yes, I know it was weird. Or I got COVID, what, 2020, I can't remember. It was like after the big COVID scare had passed, after everybody had gotten off of quarantine, and isolation and whatnot. And I got COVID. And I was like, really? So by the time I came back after having COVID, my aunt had hired Sheila to help take care of grandma, what was originally one Saturday a month. Then it became 2 Saturdays. Then I gave up taking care of grandmas on Saturday because I was like, it was becoming too much for me for my mental and physical well-being to only have one day off. And that's something that we will discuss. In 2024, my grandma passed away. And I ended up with a back injury and haven't been able to work since. And I was just like, okay, now's the time. And it wasn't just like the sudden realization. It took a lot of convincing and getting over like imposter syndrome. And I started really like getting more integrity about this and doing what I said I was going to. In other words, doing what I said I was going to do, which was to start finding a way to reach out and create a caregiving community. So that's what hopefully I've done with. Now you can find me on Facebook, find me on YouTube, find me on Patreon. I do have a book upcoming. It's almost completed, and then I just have to find a publisher. I do have a course that I am developing as well for the non-medical caregiver, with again tips and tricks that I've learned over the years. So those will be forthcoming in addition to the social media channels. You can also find me on, Twitter X and basically over most social media platforms. You can find me and I will be uploading videos. I will be every Wednesday uploading a video to YouTube, putting a link on the Facebook page, putting a link in Twitter, putting a link in to the Patreon. But hopefully what I envision for this community is, like I said, tips and tricks for caregivers, but also a place where you don't feel so isolated. Like I said, I was fortunate. I had family members around. I had the student nurses around. I had the hospice workers around. But, when it's 3:00 in the morning and you're like just now getting to bed at like 6:00 in the morning after you've like cleaned the person up for the umpteenth time, and you finally gotten to take a shower because, let's face it, after you clean somebody up that's had that much, then you want to take a shower too and get yourself cleaned up, and then fall into bed only to wake up like 2 hours later to let the hospice worker in. Those are the times that you feel very isolated as a caregiver. If you don't have people around, like I know my Auntie Lon, when my Uncle Fred started to decline and his Parkinson's got worse, she was on her own. She didn't have access to the resources that my mom and I did. So she would be texting me and asking me questions. She would be calling me. I would be reminding her, you're not alone. It's okay. I may be in Oklahoma, but I can still reach out by phone. I can still reach out by text. I can still reach out by Facebook Messenger and whatnot. So that is what hopefully this caregiving community will be, is a place, where you can not feel so isolated and learn some practical tips and tricks to help along your caregiving journey, and share your own experiences as you're going along, and say, hey, you know what? I found that, like, when you were talking about doing, like, walking around the house looking at stuff, this is one thing that I thought that I came across when I was looking at, like, the person that I'm caring for's home, that I realized was a danger, or realized that helped us. So for all of us to share our experiences so that we're not alone, so that you don't have to do all of this from scratch. So now that I've been rambling for almost an hour, blessings. I hope this finds you well.